Okay. Sorry, that's okay. You need to check my phone. Okay. How do you prefer to be introduced?
What do you mean? Like my title?
Yeah.
What?
I call you photojournalist. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm about to go back on and start over. I just want it to be a fresh start.
All right.
Okay, guys, in 3, 2.
This is Elizabeth Kim with Organized Voices. This is your first episode. Shout out to Chuck D for powering this podcast, for Krista Monique for curating this, and to my special guests. We're going to be talking about police reform. We're going to get right to it. Our guests today are Assemblymember Ash Kalra from San Jose, originally public defender turned Assemblymember. He'll be talking about his bills on police reform. We have Claire White from Dope Law Entertainment talking about criminal defense and criminal justice reform and police reform. We have Devontae Clark coming to talk to us about his perspective on police reform. And last but not least, we have Russell Stiger here with us. Stiger Jr. He's a photojournalist. He's actually the founder of Organized Voices. He handed off the baton to me, so thought it would be the only right thing to have him come here and talk to us about what he thinks about police reform. So since we're waiting for Devontae to get here, we have Claire White on Zoom right now, which we'll be editing into our video clip that will be dropped. It'll be available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and of course, rapstation.com under She Movement Radio. But let's start with Russell. Okay, so tell us a little bit about how you first became aware of social justice issues and a need for police reform.
Wow. Just the simple fact that I would say as a black man, you don't feel comfortable calling them other races do, I'll say. So I mean, just the simple fact that it's not a service that the black community deems as something that's easy to go to, we'll say, is more of a problem than overall than anything else, because that goes back to when you're a kid and the conversations that kids have with their parents.
How about how old did you say you were when that started formulating in your mind about that awareness?
Oh man, it just gets to a point where you don't even remember. It's just ingrained in your everyday thought process, so you kind of lose track of when that conversation actually happened. Right.
But so like your father was a senator, so you've been kind of,
He worked for
yeah, so that's interesting. So since you've been exposed to kind of the politics of the issues, the policies of the issues, what would you say? I mean, there's a lot of people out there, right, that feel the way that you do in their daily lives. But what is it that takes you from that nexus, from it being a part of your daily life to it being a step further in terms of activism or getting involved in this work and trying to change something?
Well, essentially, I grew up in the Capitol because my dad was a photographer in the Capitol.
Okay.
He started working for Willie Brown, who became the Speaker of the House, and blah, 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 right? My mom is an educator, and then my stepdad is a lawyer.
Uh-huh.
So if you just kind of combined everything just that I've kind of been through, I've taught in the Elko School District in Valley High area for 4 or 5 years. I've worked for the Assembly, the Senate, the Senate, and you just kind of start to see the different systems and the systems that are in place and how they, when you take a step back and look at where the money goes, it all starts at the Capitol.
Yeah.
And everything from the laws that are passed, everything just starts in either Capitol or City Hall. And so then just taking everything that they had, that they offered in their lifestyles, just kind of combining it just only made sense together.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to Claire here. So we're going to jump into policy, but I wanted to give an intro, like a proper intro of kind of your background as to how you became, involved or passionate about specifically police reform, because I know you've been passionate about a lot of things, injustices and such, But police reform specifically, how did you get involved with wanting change?
Man, where to even start?
You want to circle around?
I was in the service. Yeah. Can you hear me? I was,
Yeah.
Are we good? Can you hear me? Hi there. Gosh, where to start? I don't know. I spent some time in the military, and I was kind of like caught up when I was young, like right post 9/11, this idea that like, I don't know, enemies were foreign and not domestic. And then, I don't know, they're killing people, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Every day they kill Tamir Rice, they kill, the children, you know what I'm saying? It's just unavoidable. I have been blessed to have been exposed to people who showed me what was going on, you know what I'm saying? And showed me the way. And it's one of those things that like, once you take the goggles off, like you can't put them back on again, you can't unsee it. And so, I don't know, my dad was arrested when I was a kid. My parents didn't go to college, neither my parents, and we grew up without a lot. And my dad was like growing pot in the backyard when we were young, in like the 80s when it was still like a big deal. And the cops came and took him, and we had no money for a lawyer. We didn't have shit. And if he even had spent some like real time in jail, it would have really fucked us over. And this lawyer like he took my dad's case in exchange for my dad like doing his bathroom, and it changed our lives, and I realized that was like a real place where, in terms of where my role in the revolution is, that I could make a direct difference for people who are facing the worst shit that's out there. So I don't know, it's a long story, but that's the short version of it. My late husband, Dr. Prince White, was a prophet in terms of this work and police reform and police abolition. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm an abolitionist, not a reformer, but I'm also a realist. I live in the world as it is. So that's where I'm at. I run a law firm now, and I snatch people out of cages as much as possible. And I'm blessed to have a clientele who have platforms. And so I'm humbled to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thanks for your perspective. So just to explain what Organized Voices was created for is to inform our communities of national and local social justice issues. We're trying to bring light to a lot of the stories that the media covers very superficially, but doesn't really get into the root of how it's affecting our people at the ground level, at the street level. And oftentimes these issues affect us where it is, people that are most marginalized. The more money you make, the more removed you are from the front lines. And so it's very important that we organize our voices to allow those voices to be heard, because ultimately all those issues that are on the front lines does impact us. If nothing else, it's the taxpayer dollars that we're spending, right? So Russell, do you want to speak to a little bit about how the frontline issues, how that impacts people, at various levels, not just the front lines, but people maybe like in the NFL or, in the entertainment industry, or how should those people recognize that how this impacts them?
Well, I think a lot of them recognize it, but I think there's a certain level of difference about how you can speak out versus NFL versus NBA. So in the NBA, you have guaranteed contracts. Your rookie contract in the first round is guaranteed for the first 4 years, blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. So you have more security blanket to speak because you have a guaranteed contract. If you sign the next big deal, you have a guaranteed contract. The commissioner behind them is lets them speak out more versus the NFL, which is has more reputation of good old boy. The fact that the contracts aren't guaranteed then kind of makes it to where they can, as soon as you get cut or they find a reason to cut you, they can then remove you from their platform, essentially, and limiting the platform that you already have. So until like the recent video went around with Patrick Mahomes and all the various NFL stars, then coming out and prompted the reaction from the commissioner, which then kind of gave more players the confidence they needed that they could do the work and they could use their voices, because essentially they were always told to just be quiet and play football.
Right. So we've got some major legislation right now in the wake of these series of police terrorist murders. I know that's an inflammatory statement, but it's actually the only way we can describe what we're seeing right now. Video after video, footage after footage of our brothers and sisters being murdered in the streets with no accountability to the officers that are committing these murders. And they're protected by something called the Qualified Immunity Act. And the Graham versus Connor reasonableness test, and I know Claire can speak a little bit better to that, but you know, there's these bills that are coming out, and I do want to quickly ask you before we turn it over to Claire for her legal assessment of those, what kind of power can those people with platforms have in affecting change for something that, you know, can be subject to review by the Supreme Court?
First, doing things like educating people and encouraging them to vote. I mean, of course, you vote for the president and everything else, but it's really important to vote for the local legislation and the regional legislation that goes on. And then with the players that have the platform, to bring light about educate themselves on the bills that are coming out that are important to them. Not every bill, but one or two.
Yeah.
And use that to support a bill that is dear to them.
Right.
And that means something to them, that they can just minimally educate themselves on the basic pros and the basic cons.
Okay. So Claire, do you want to speak to the Qualified Immunity Act and how it's really prevented us from ever, you know, bringing any officers accountable for any misconduct or violation of constitutional rights? I know Danny wants to jump in so bad. You're welcome.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
He probably has a lot more to say. I mean, I'll give you my 2 cents, and then I would love to hear what Danny has to say, because that's the work he does. You know what I mean? Like, you know, when you're asking me about that, what I'm thinking about is like, qualified immunity refers to who pays. That's all it really is about. It's like, who pays? You know what I'm saying? Like, is it the cop who pays? Is it the union who pays? Is it the taxpayers who pays? Is it the, you know, so when we talk about like accountability, we're talking about capitalist fucking justice. We're not talking about justice for people's lives. We're not talking about stopping the killings. We're not talking about stopping the terror or the murder. We're talking about like, oh, do we go after their pension? Or like, you know what I mean? So like, yeah, in capitalism, the only justice that there is fucking money. So like, people should get paid, you know, as one part of being accountable and whatnot. But, you know, qualified immunity is really a question of like, does the cop have to pay himself, or is he immune from, you know, stuff that he does in the scope of his responsibilities? And so, you know, do I have hope for that legislation? Like, it's just shifting money around. You know, it's not about, will they kill less people if they think it's going to cost them money? Maybe. I fucking hope so. But that's not how we stop the murders, in my humble opinion. You know, in terms of my legal analysis, like, cop kills, when my clients, you know, are accused of killing people in the street, it's not just a question of like, oh, who's going to pay for it? It's a question of like, are they now going into a cage for the rest of their life? And
Right.
We're not even at that discussion with these cops. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're talking about who's going to pay for it. And, you know, that ain't justice to me. So.
Absolutely. Hey, Danny, do you want to come and speak to us about that?
Sure.
Okay, so we're going to have an impromptu guest jump in to talk about qualified immunity, because this is his forte. This is Danny Garza, by the way, the one who got shot in the face 2 weeks. Is it been 2 weeks? Almost 2 weeks at the most violent action we've had in Sacramento. You gotta stay.
So qualified immunity. I didn't hear too much of what Claire said, but it's specific to civil rights actions. The case is Harlow versus Fitzgerald.
Okay.
I think that's right. Fitzsimmons, Harlow, something like that.
Who knows?
And there's two elements to it that will get a police officer off for civil rights violations. That there has to be a constitutional violation and has to be clearly established. And the clearly established part is very hard, because that means there needs to be a case that's on point on every detail, on every fact of the case you're bringing. There has to be a previous case on point. So let's say a cop put a gun to somebody's head for no reason during the day, but your case, but the case that's on point it happened at night and yours happened during the day, that little detail might be enough for the judge to say, oh, well, you know what? It wasn't clearly established because the cop didn't know he couldn't do this at night or day, whatever it is. And that could be enough. That could be enough to completely dismiss a civil rights action under 42 USC 1983. And it's growing. This doctrine is growing, so it's becoming harder and harder and harder to sue police officers and hold them accountable.
All right, so let me just,
Yeah.
because everything you guys say is way above my head. I don't even know what exactly you guys are talking about necessarily, but I just have one question. I don't know who can answer.
Yeah.
Is it something that can be removed? And what does it take, even if it's hard or not, what would it take to remove that shield, I guess?
That's a very good question. So it shouldn't take very much because it's a judicially created rule. Judges created this, not Congress, not the state legislators. Judges came in and said, we want to shield police officers.
Okay.
And in the beginning, there was a good reason. It had to do with like insurance liability, who was going to pay, and how do you fight back against things that an officer genuinely would not know was illegal.
Okay.
But this has snowballed into stuff that is obviously illegal. They're still doing it and using qualified immunity. So how do we get rid of it? We need either the Supreme Court to overturn it, which surprisingly, Clarence Thomas is the judge most in favor of doing away with qualified immunity. There could be congressional action. They can withdraw it and maybe put certain standards for some very basic protections, which would be reasonable. But the way we have it now is it's almost impossible to bring a civil rights case.
Look, I got to jump in a little bit here. About the answer to my thoughts on your question.
Yeah.
Which is that to bring us back to basics, like what we're talking about here is whether or not we could sue these cops or not. Ultimately, like that's the justice we're talking about. So like when anyone comes to me with a legal problem, and let's say right now that legal problem is these cops are fucking murdering people, right? Like what do we do about it? Oftentimes what I have to tell them is the courts are not the place where we get justice, right? It's not, I mean, like I understand wanting to push legislation and we should, you know what I'm saying? I'm not talking about abandoning that, but as a reminder, right? Like ultimately this goal, if we walk down this path, is about can we sue them or not? And I don't know if suing them is going to be enough to make them stop fucking murdering people in the street. You know what I mean? Like, because if we do away with qualified immunity, what we know is that the law is set up to defend white supremacy and capitalism. Like that's what the law's function is. So as soon as we like strike down this little clause of this little thing, like they're not going to replace it with fucking liberation theology. You know what I mean? Unless we do that. So in terms of what kind of change can we make, like, the civil courts only have so much remedy. There's such a thing as the police officers' Bill of Rights in California. That shit's got to go. You know what I'm saying? Cops have special protections that like protect their privacy around the fucked up things that they do. And so chipping away at some of that and like bringing the shit that they do in the dark out into the light is one thing that could make a big difference. Another thing that could make a big difference is public defenders across this country have fucking treasure troves of the most disgusting body camera footage you've ever fucking seen. And in theory, most of them check little boxes that say that they're only supposed to use it for certain types of purposes. But massive fucking dump of the body camera footage, the most heinous body camera footage out there, along with all of the voices of, you know, the cell phone cameras that were lucky enough to squeak out, or the body camera footage that were lucky enough to squeak out after like 2 years later. Like we need to know what's happening now. Like transparency, I feel like maybe is a road to trying to curb some of that shit.
Yeah.
And to piggyback off what you said, I want to make clear what civil rights law does. And it's toothless. In this country, civil rights law is toothless, and it always has been, because an officer can kill somebody. And when we sue them in a civil rights action, all you get is money. There's no justice there. The money doesn't even come from the officer. The money either comes from taxpayers or it comes from an insurance pool. So what justice really was there? We can get the family some money for people who died, and yeah, that helps. But is that justice? The answer is no. It's not justice, and it's not fair, and it's at every level the cops are shielded.
So speaking about justice, that's why I feel like you have to use every opportunity to chip away at the armor that you were talking about, to all of a sudden leave them, because when you go for the big things, it seems too impossible sometimes, right? So then essentially you have people who are marching for, I don't want to say no reason, but they're not marching for a cause necessarily that they can at least see
something tangible.
And so going back to her point, I always just feel like if you do chip away, it's like the death of a thousand cuts, right? They don't necessarily notice the first couple, but then once one thing is removed, and another thing is removed, and another thing is removed, it becomes a domino effect, because then other people see that, oh, okay, so we can create the change and more. And so even starting with I always had an issue with the fact that the taxpayers pay for it, because essentially you're saying that the parent is paying for is being punished for the kid, right? And so the kid goes out and does this whatever, and then the parent ends up paying whatever, but the kid sees no repercussion. So even just to your point, I think it would at least change your mind for a second that if you fire this trigger and that you're wrong, your career is done. Your retirement is gone. That will then make you think twice. I would hope that before you actually fire, I would think that you would exhaust more options before you actually pull the trigger.
And so we're trying to attack it from different angles, right? So the Qualified Immunity Act is one angle in terms of holding officers.
Oh, it's not an act. It's a judicially made rule.
Well, yeah. So
not legislated.
The Qualified Immunity, what would you call that?
Rule.
Would attack the civil liability of an officer's conduct. What would hold them criminally liable for murder or misconduct of a
That's already the law. It's just like enforcing the law as it stands. It's illegal to murder somebody. You know what I'm saying? If a cop murders somebody, here's the thing, right? There are two ways in most states.
Yeah.
There are two ways to get charges, right, against you. One way is the DA makes a decision to file charges against you, and then you have a case, right? The other way is if you get indicted by a grand jury. But even that way, the prosecutor has to bring the case to the grand jury, right? So it's a prosecutor's decision about whether they're going to either directly file charges against a murderous cop, or whether they're going to have a grand jury try to indict a murderous cop. And so it's these prosecutors who are not making decisions, or are making decisions, because the decision not to file is a decision. And we see how quick they are to file against everybody, but they are not filing criminal charges against cops, and we don't need new laws to make them do that. The laws are already on the books.
So to that point, I know that Chesa Bodine from San Francisco is pushing with several other DAs to ask the state bar to recognize it as a conflict of interest in having DAs bring charges against police officers. What can we do as a people to support that in eliminating that conflict of interest issue between a DA?
So the state bar is the organization that controls lawyers' licenses, including prosecutors, right? We all have to get our license through the state bar of our state.
Right.
And if the state bar says that we are not allowed to do something ethically, then we are not allowed to do it. And if the state bar says it's unethical for you prosecutors to make charging decisions about the cops that you work with every day, then they will not be allowed to do that anymore, or they will lose their licenses.
So let me here. The petition that they're filing right now is prohibiting police associations from donating to DA campaigns. Do you feel that that's sufficient to tackle this problem?
No, I don't think that fucking matters. I mean, look, money is money and it's important, you know what I mean? But like every individual cop is going to be able to donate to the DAs. Like they're just going to put that money through some other channels. Like they're smarter about how they move their money than we are. You know, whether they give money or not is really ultimately not the issue, I don't think.
I have a question for you. So in Sacramento, before Steinberg was elected, we were going through the Strong Mayor campaign, right? From what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the mayor in Minneapolis, when the George Floyd case happened, he is considered a strong mayor or something like that, correct?
He has the power.
He has the power. So what is it? Because there's often the confusion on who has power and who is elected to wield the power, and who has actual power that is a chosen position, right? So like, because isn't the city manager who handles a lot of things, but that's not an actual elected position. So then I guess part of the problem that I think some of these are talking about is there's a lot of different situations as far as mayors, what they have power of in each part, but then I guess would there, and essentially a secondary question, is there a way that the families could even prosecute or I guess go after the police officer who committed the murder and actually be able to have access to a full investigation similar to it? Like why does it have to only be a district attorney or something who decides on those charges? Why can't, if my brother was murdered, if I'm Stevante, why can't I hire a lawyer to directly prosecute them for those police officers for murder? Does that have to do with the mayors and the strong and some, or are they too different?
No, it's a state thing. I think Claire would be able to answer this.
Yeah, so like way back in the day, like under the common law, right, there were precedent for what we would call private prosecutions, right, where private individuals could engage in a criminal prosecution against a person. But in the modern law, and this is like for a long time back now in the modern law, the idea is that the victim of a crime is the prosecuting agency of a crime is the people collectively, right? And that we collectively are the only ones who have the moral authority and legal authority to bring criminal charges against an individual. For an individual who has been harmed to get their own justice, that's what we have created the civil system for, right? So this whole, and what we have said, I mean, I didn't mean to minimize it too much earlier when I talked about it's just money. There's two types of relief you can get as an individual if you go to try and seek justice, right, on your own. You can get money, and the court is allowed to force some agency or entity or person who harmed you or is harming you to stop doing something or to do something, right? So, for example, it was civil rights lawyers who got them to stop tear gassing people in Ferguson, Missouri. You know what I'm saying? It was civil rights lawyers who were going and like forcing prison reform and like realignment with overcrowding. You know, it was, civil rights lawyers who went to court when the legislative shit just wasn't enough. And they got judges, right, to enforce the rights that are supposedly already on the books. And those individuals can make changes in a very broad way in terms of like what is allowed and not allowed in policing or in prisons. So, the civil justice piece is where an individual can get, in theory, some kind of action on their own. But when it's criminal and when the penalty could be incarceration, the only option is for the state to try you, or the feds. But, the agents of the state are the only ones who can wield that power. And that's like constitutionally vested. So
since California has, I'm going to just say like loosely, the ability to change certain things and laws without going too technical, is that something that as a state we could at least work towards, is to be able to allow civil rights attorneys to prosecute them, at least in California?
I think I have a good idea for this. And it's something, a somewhat pet project I've been trying to promote for a while. One thing I think that would help is a California State Police Licensing Commission. Okay. All right. This would give officers required training, mandatory training that's universal, that's uniform. They would get a license number. They would have to display their license as they're enforcing the law. Mm-hmm. And this agency should also take over for internal affairs. So they're not investigating. departments aren't
who
investigating.
who would consist of this agency?
It would be lawyers, and I don't know if this would be legal or not, but I would say they cannot be former police officers.
We're starting fresh.
So yeah,
Scratch them all.
and
Start fresh.
and I think this organization, when for certain crimes, they should have prosecutorial powers. I don't know how legal that is. Maybe Claire would know, but this system might fix a lot of what is wrong in our system now.
And I want to point out that it's very similar to how the state bar works and how attorneys are regulated by their own body of government that regulates attorneys. So
well, I would even say, A, I love that idea. B, I would say that what I feel like it mimics very closely is something that Danny and I both have a lot of personal experience with, and that's the military justice system, right? Like, they have their own, what's called the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It is far more strict and stringent than the regular ass American laws. They can incarcerate you, if you on their own. And they're treated almost like their own separate state, right? So like if you get a DUI and you're active duty military, you could be prosecuted both by the military and by whatever fucking state you're in, because they're that separate, and they both can incarcerate you. The idea of the other thing that I think mirrors that is this idea of civilian control of the military, right? Like that's something that's supposedly ingrained into our system of government is civilian control of the military. And a body of like a regulatory body, like what Danny is describing, that is not comprised of any current or former police officers or law enforcement, right, would function like civilian control of what is, we all should acknowledge, is a domestic militarized force, right? So having them with their own like enhanced code of conduct, which can be criminally enforced in its own way, I think might be something that's really powerful. And I would prefer it definitely to private prosecutions, but because what we have to remember is that we live in capitalism. And if we say private people can prosecute people, then that means Walmart's gonna be prosecuting all of us motherfuckers, and it's like, then we become like step into corporate overlord in terms of like who can criminally prosecute you. Like we have, in theory, we did away with debtor's prison in this country. Right, but that's the type of thing that we would see immediately, because that's who would be coming after people, is people who have money and want money. That's
I guess this is my thing is our system supposedly made to have checks and balances, right?
Right.
But right now we have a bunch of checks with no balances.
Exactly.
And so, while people are actively protesting, just as in Atlanta, being that who was murdered by the cops, it's just that I don't want to see people protesting only and just saying names, like giving people something to actually fight for and something that they can see is crucial, because otherwise it's just going to be.
I love that. No, and that's one of the things I've been going to protest and organizing for a long time, and I never like it when I don't have something tangible that I can say, This is what I want.
Exactly.
This is what we want, instead of just being, I'm mad.
Exactly.
And so when you're mad, you'll go away.
Exactly.
And you'll be mad at home.
And going to what Liz was saying about the whole, Claire, just so you kind of understand where organized voices came from. It came from the idea, first from a blackvoters.org that my dad tried. Then we rebranded it to just vote. And I came, and after meeting with like my friend Eric Harris and his dad, we kind of came up with the acronym Voices Organized to Educate. Then as I met Liz, we were kind of just talking about different things in media and how would you, and what was sort of like, I guess, a rallying, something that when it was self-explanatory, right? To where, and we were just playing around with the words that voices organized to, we were just playing around with that. And so I just always, that's always just behind whatever it is that I say is always going to be organizing the voices. I don't care necessarily what the message overall is, because I don't know. I'm just trying to pick up what you guys are saying and bring it to layman's terms, because and figuring out what is the solution behind it, because I understand that there's a bunch of problems, but if we organize everybody, what is the voices of the organized going to say?
Exactly.
So one of the type of like tangible things I think that that communities can do without waiting for all of the communities to do together, which is more kind of this like state licensing sort of thing. Individual communities can and do build these civilian police oversight commissions, right? Where it's these like boards of community members who have varying powers depending on what the city gives them. And sometimes they're toothless and sometimes they're not, you know, but it would be really inspiring to see a civilian police council who had the authority to fire police officers. And I haven't seen that anywhere. I don't know if any city in America has it, but having one that could fire police officers for misconduct would, I mean, I think be a game changer.
Right. So I just want to reiterate that we're not here to assert that we have necessarily specific answers, but we definitely want to rally the voices of people who might have ideas, who are in positions of power, who have platforms, to come together to this table. And Russ has often taught me about, you know, not trying to figure out all the answers by yourself, but bringing the people in that may have the answers. And that's really what Organized Voices stands for. On that note, there's a reparations bill that just passed through the Assembly this week. Dr. Shirley Weber put that together. It's going to the Senate now. The bill outlines that 8 individuals in social justice reform are going to be delegating as to how the reparations are going to be dispersed. So I just wanted to get kind of your thoughts on that. How would they appropriately choose 8 social justice reformists to be able to then figure out and adequately represent the people and how this reparations is dispersed? This is
just getting my 40 acres in the mule, man. Just getting your house, a
start,
car,
right?
and a good business loan or something. I mean, not even a loan, and grant. Like, I don't want to pay that back.
Right. But the reason I want to point this out is because when it goes to the Senate, we as the people have the opportunity to go and testify at the hearings to let them hear our voices on how this needs to be dispersed. So it's very crucial right now, civic engagement and civic participation, because they need to hear from you on how this should be granted, right? It's very significant right now. That's all of our voices having to go. We have to go to the Senate for this, because we can't just rely on these 8 people to know what's best for all of us, right? For all of the Black people to get reparations.
I don't necessarily think, I think as long as you don't try to narrow it specifically down and just, once again, just starting with the 40 acres in the mule. Like, if you have a place to live, that's yours, not an apartment, not somewhere that your landlord is going to raise the rent. If you have a car, that's good that you can get to work back and forth, right? And then on top of that, you like, I don't believe that, because some people will try to say, oh, we should give everybody free college. I mean, college is cool, but I went to CRC for most of mine, so I didn't spend that much money. And so it's like, and I paid out of pocket. So it's like, I ain't spend that much money. So my sister went to USC, that's like 40 bands a year.
Right.
So it's not, that's never going to be equal if you're sitting there saying, oh, I'm going to pay for college, because then if all of a sudden you're going to pay for college, everybody can't get into USC. Everybody can't get into, you know, so that's never going to be equal. So that's why I always just try to just keep it as basic. I mean, either now, maybe if you don't want to have school money, but then, okay, you have money to start a business or whatever, but like, I think when you try to start dictating people's lives other than just the basics of transportation and a place to live, I think you're doing too much. Personally, I think you're trying to be too correct. Like, but that's just, anything other than that to me is just more like, all right, I guess that's cool. I just need a house and a car. Like, I can make the rest work.
Right. What are some ethical concerns you might see with coming out of this? Do you think that it's all like just for show, or do you think it's genuine?
It's just such a hard issue, and there's no correct answer, because you're not going to satisfy everybody, and it's hard, and this might be a little off, but I think we should start with giving people free healthcare, making sure people are fed, that we have clean water, that we have good public education, and there's basic necessities that we can do right now. Take that from the military. We don't need to be in Iraq. We don't need to be in Afghanistan. We don't need to be in, we have something like 700 bases around the world. We don't need any of that, especially when we have people, little Johnny has cancer, he's gonna die because he doesn't have insurance. Like, what kind of country are we?
Have you seen the show Space Force on Netflix?
I saw the preview, but
there was a scene where they were in court, and the congresswoman from New York was like, you know, or somebody mentioned they put it in reality of how much they're spending versus like that being like 10 schools or something, right? So like, a $4 million missile is like X amount of schools, right? And it just goes what you're saying as far as when you're spending, they have no problem having prototypes that cost millions and millions of dollars. But like I asked my mom when she was an educator, she was one of the superintendents for K through 6 bro. Like, what could you do with that same amount of money? Right. Like, with just something that they built to blow up? Mm-hmm. What could you do with that same amount of money investing?
Or just come up with $1,200.
Because it's never a factor of them not having the money.
Right.
The factor of where the budget is determined who decides where that money goes first.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's never an issue of the money. I mean, if we start talking about military waste, I mean, it's never an issue of how much money there is. The thing I want to say about reparations, I guess, is that I'm in favor of any legislation that puts money in the pockets of Black people. Like, I just, so I don't know about like how to distribute it and who's going to be in charge. I hope Black people are in charge of how it gets distributed. I mean, how to pick them. That's for minds smarter than mine. But I can say that, genuine or not, I don't give a fuck. Put money in the pockets of Black people. Like, I don't care what the motivations even ultimately are if they're putting money in the pockets of Black people, especially these young Black men in the street who I'm dealing with on the raw end of, the most fucked up policing that we've seen in generations. You know what I mean? Like, when we're talking about these incarceration numbers and the types of family destruction that is happening as a result of state action, fuck yeah, put money in the pockets of Black people. And all I can say about my thoughts about that is it ain't enough. It ain't enough. More, more. That's what I have to say.
Give them some money. Some people, like option A could be you take a set amount of money. Option B could be
you can have
you take
three
the 40
options.
hours in the mule.
Right.
Option C could be, you want the top level education and whatever. Like I agree with you on that. Not really. I just don't like people telling necessarily what to do. But I do agree with some form of tangible money that you can invest in yourself or that you could do something with, whether it's investing in your education or educating yourself just through life.
No, some people I've talked to, actually the last podcast I was on, they had talked about things like given land, or, maybe a better credit score, starting their credit over so that any bad credit is erased. Ways that they can really mobilize themselves and elevate themselves in society in ways that, they've been oppressed to not be able to do. Tuition to schools of their choice, things like that. And really having a pipeline program to where they can become professionals, they can become lawmakers.
Not even just tuition, though. You actually have to let them into the school.
Right.
You actually let them get out in a reasonable time.
Right.
It's one thing to sit there and say, oh yeah, we'll pay for you to go to UCLA, but then UCLA doesn't admit you. What do you do?
Right.
So I want to point out where this conversation started and where it's at now. We started with police brutality and police violence, and now we're talking about systemic societal changes, which is the answer to police brutality.
Exactly.
All that violence and crime, it starts from poverty. It starts from poverty, from hunger, from not having shelter, from not knowing how you're going to feed your kids. That's where it starts. You address that, and it's a domino effect. You're going to take care of all these other problems. And we did that organically in our conversation.
Yeah.
That's where it led.
Thank you for bringing us back.
Thank you for encapsulating.
Yes, I
well,
appreciate
and that gives me the opportunity to explain. So I teach social justice studies at American River College, and one of the foundational points that we start with is the colonialization of the United States. And so what they've done as an institution of the United States is acting as oppressors, first to legitimize themselves by means of treaties where they didn't have a recognition of authority within the international communities. Like, they ran away from Europe to escape whatever they were trying to escape in that continent, to come here to basically be renegades, to start a whole country. And they killed the Native Americans here. They lied to the Native Americans and then promised them a whole bunch of stuff. And then they forced them to sign treaties when really they didn't have treaty signing power. So it's actually the Native Americans who gave them the legitimacy to even have authority to sign such a treaty. And of the 300 treaties that were ever signed, all of them have been broken. So this method of oppression is what racism is. It's what police brutality is. It's all a byproduct of an oppressive role that they're playing, and to keep that role of oppression alive and prevalent in this country.
So just think about this, though. Think about the fact that there are Black people who successfully in terms of money that they generate, run all type of illegal operations because they don't have the same opportunities to run a legitimate organization. violation.
Right.
And so you can't say that they don't have the ability to make the money around the business, because then the police forces, they wouldn't invest so much money in gang task forces or drug task forces to take them down. So it's never been about that we can't do it. It's just not having the opportunities to, or not even the knowledge or the ideas that it's possible to do it when you're growing up. But then that also goes back to what we were talking about before, the public schools, the education. I mean, it's just so, it's so big of a problem that nobody really wants to, like, they don't really want to address it head on. And that's why I always feel like you got to go with the approach of just taking one or two little things at a time and just trying to build off those victories.
And so the most powerful tool of an oppressor is to normalize the oppression. So it makes you believe that you can't challenge the status quo. That's how they win, and that's how they create their control and maintain their control. Everything that they do is in the interest of maintaining control. So that's where our system is flawed. That's exactly the pinpoint of where our system is flawed. It's not designed to have equal playing field for us. It's designed so that the oppressors can exercise control over the subordinate group.
So look at the electoral colleges that you're talking about.
Oppression.
Like in California, pretty much until we recently changed up when we did our election dates, we didn't really have that much to say in the last couple of elections. Like, I mean,
right. It doesn't matter that the popular
vote. It really
vote
doesn't matter when we vote.
Right.
And I've explained to people, like, my vote does not weigh the same as somebody else's in another state.
And it's one state.
And so, exactly. So it's like, so even the electoral college is a system that, because they try to say essentially, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's pretty much based on the fact that that even though the masses can elect the people that the person that they feel is right, they still don't know that they don't know any better. So we have to check their boundaries.
Maybe the system was good back then,
yes,
because they didn't have instant communication.
Yes.
They'd have to take these big voter boxes,
yep,
carry them by horse or by foot. But you know, but
why does Atlanta's voting polls always run out of electricity?
Well, hold on. I just want to be clear about some of that on the record, though, right? Like what the Electoral College's purpose is, right? Because it functions in a very fucked up and oppressive and divisive way. But the idea behind the Electoral College is it's supposed to be a balance on the idea that some states with gigantic population can control all of the important decision making, right? Whereas little tiny states who don't have a lot of people in them, who have different needs, for example, might get fucked over. So the concept is while there's 2 or 3 states, California and New York would run the board every time, right? And we also know that those states with the highest population also have the highest minority population. So keeping the Electoral College also enforces white supremacy. Let's not get it twisted, right? But they hide in the idea, and it's important to understand their justifications in order to communicate with them about it, right? And their justification is that people in Iowa, even if there's less of them, have as much, in terms of unique need for governance as people in California or New York. And so the Electoral College is supposed to be a way to balance out the power of more populous states versus the power of less populous states.
And I guess my question to that, though, was what the hell does that matter with the president? I get
it. At all, right? The president doesn't do any of that. I hear you.
But that's what you have, your Congress members and your assembly members. So I still just, even though the example that you made, I mean, your explanation made entire sense, but it still doesn't make sense to me overall why in this day and age it's still needed, other than the fact that you said about the oppressive factor of it and that and everything else. So I mean,
no, I agree with you. I agree with you. I just, for those of us listening who may not have that background on what that shit even is about, you know what I'm saying? It's really helpful for them to have a context of what their grandpa's going to say when they're like, hey, this shit is not with it, and they're like, oh, well, what about the farmers in Iowa? It's nah, well, that doesn't matter for the president, like you're saying. What the fuck? That's some outdated shit, But these opponents of ours like to hold on to that outdated shit and drive it like a big giant flag on the back of their truck,
And that's why I appreciate your explanation, because even though you explain exactly what it's for, you still also acknowledge the fact that that has nothing to do with what it's actually used for.
Right.
And that's why, I mean, in my eyes, it just gotta go. And that to me is the main mission that everybody should be trying to figure out is.
Yeah, so we need to attack the Electoral College. It's going to be a big pie to attack. But getting back to police reform, because that's kind of like the root of things, and then how that will trickle down is definitely going to impact how police reform looks like. But let's talk about this buzz term, defund the police, because it's being talked about by a lot of people. It's getting a lot of people riled up. Huh? Oh,
For your life.
okay.
You have viewers.
Okay, let me
Maybe sit on that microphone.
okay. All right, you guys.
I was actually gonna ask you about that too. Because I
Actually, tone it
kept
down.
hearing about this whole defunding the
Yeah.
police, but I felt like it was too much for me to read out what time to actually figure out.
Yeah,
what they were
no,
talking about.
I know. Okay. You guys are just gonna have to lean in.
Sorry.
You're gonna have to get over it.
Is there a way you can flip your phone?
I don't know what's going on. Oh, does it work?
I don't know. That'll be all right.
They'll be all right.
Sacrifice.
All right, thanks.
So
Yeah, let's talk about defunding the police.
defunding.
I don't think it's-
And this is an idea, and people have different ideas of what it means, but the basics is to take money away from the police budget, because we have the police doing too much. We have them going to deal with homelessness, mental health issues, suicides, children, youth, juveniles, and cops are trained to deal with crime with violence. That's their job. They use violence to enforce the law. What are we doing sending them to places social workers should be? So defund the police means take money from the police budget and invest that in social workers and into people who do these specific jobs, because it's going to make the police job easier, because they're not jacks of all trades. They know one thing: enforce the law and use violence. I guess that's stupid, right? We could hire social workers. Somebody calls, hey, I think I'm thinking about killing myself.
Well,
why are we sending the cops?
Well, let me
Send
ask you
social
this, because you two are both military, both from military.
Yeah.
Would that be kind of something that would be another option back home for them, or like even like just because I guess my point is like as you're saying, police are trained to handle, I'm gonna say, extreme situations, right? As far as with violence, right? So like, you want them, if you come home and somebody's been murdered, or your house has been broken into, or somebody's in your house, something like that, right? But then you don't necessarily need them for
You're having trouble with your teenager. You don't need the cops coming.
Or even domestic, even to a certain extent, domestic violence.
To an extent, yeah.
That's correct. Those situations, because now when you have policies of somebody's going to go to jail when they come out, and somebody else, and that call gets made, and somebody has to go to jail, what's the impact of them having to go to jail because of the policing, and they're trying to meet the needs of the force? Essentially, like that's but we don't know how to deal with this, so we're just going to just say, you know what? Hopefully, by saying somebody will go to jail, that should stop y'all from.
It fixes the problem for the police in the moment.
Yeah.
We don't have any other tools to deal with this. I have handcuffs and I can take you to jail, so that's what I'm going to do. Those are my tools, and that's what they do. And now our prisons are filled up with nonsense.
So we got a social worker.
If you have a social worker, they can take the kid and be like, hey, what's really wrong? What's up? Is there
Talking.
Yeah,
would you also still advise, because there are dangerous situations, for an officer to go? Because
maybe they can assist the social worker, but stay in the background.
Exactly.
And unless you're called, you sit in your car.
Yeah, exactly. Just being there to provide a certain level of protection.
Yeah.
For the social workers.
But they don't know what they're doing. And a lot of times CPS social workers will go somewhere with an officer. They'll do checkups with officers because they're the social worker. Officers are for protection. They don't do anything. They stand back. They shut up.
Do they go consistently with like the same officers? So like there's
I'm not sure. That's not my field, but I know that happens.
Okay, I was curious, like if the police.
Did you guys hear San Francisco starting the new? They're announcing that they're implementing a new program where certain calls they're going to be deploying social workers, medical staff and
Yeah.
volunteers dealing with homeless and mentally ill. If they know that, then they're not deploying police. So San Francisco is going to actually start that program. They just announced it this week.
That would be interesting to see
Right.
something like Kevin Carter, maybe as an example, going out and being adequately funded to deal with the problem. You know, being able to have people and resources behind him and not just, I'm not saying he does, I don't know exactly what he does
And
but just having like using those communal resources with the backup of the police for just the overall protection of the assets of Kevin Carter and stuff like that. But just kind of like, I guess as you were talking, like not using them so much for the immediate response, using more of a social worker community people. But then what does that take law-wise for that to happen in like California or Sacramento?
Allocation of money.
Yeah, that's just a budgetary decision, you know, like the same way they take money away from schools and put it in other shit, the same way they took money away from the music program or the arts programs and put it in other shit, the same way they took money away from the parks departments and put it in other shit. They just take money away from the police department and put it in other shit. You know, it's just about what bucket it goes in.
Right.
And the idea is if you don't need to use that money because you're not doing those things anymore, then we're going to take that money and give it to the people we need to have do that stuff. You know, the federal government does this all the time. You know, they'll shut down whole agencies and like just sweep them in under different ones and they'll give them their money, you know. And so it's really just about money decisions, which are either made at the county level or the city level or the state level. And, you know, we're supposed to have input into that.
Sacramento County, tomorrow there's a 10 a.m. press conference in front of the Board of Supervisors office. People are rallying on a budgetary decision that the supervisors are going to make about how they're going to allocate funds to law enforcement. So in those moments, we have to show up as a community to really put the pressure on how they spend the money. Because I will say that this community has already been stretched thin trying to offer those services through volunteer organizations. People that aren't getting paid are doing this work already. You know, there's a homeless coalition out there serving meals and hand sanitizers illegally every single day for the homeless. Now, the census reports that there's only like 4,000 homeless people when the homeless coalition has counted there to be like 13,000 people.
Oh, yeah.
So those numbers are, you know, wrong. They're not accurate. And, you know, NLG, for example, we're out there monitoring the police to make sure that there's no civil rights violations. The city and the county should be doing those things, but we instead have volunteer organizations doing that work. And we're doing it grassroots with no funding backed up from anybody besides, you know, donors.
So like, I know people throw percentages out there a lot, and that kind of changes what people think. But like, what is if you were to say a number wise, not percentage wise, what's a number? 1 million, 2 million, 1.5 of taking away from the police budget would be, because like, you know, you have Measure U, or was it Measure U the last one that didn't get passed? So like, what is an actual tangible number, first of all, that should be considered? Because like you say the police budget, but what is the actual police budget? Like, what is 10% of the police budget?
I could correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the county of Sacramento spends about 1/3 of their entire budget on the sheriff's department.
And 1/3 of what's their entire budget?
A lot. Like,
I think people need to understand, like,
yeah, so I don't know those numbers, but those numbers are knowable. And for anyone listening who wants to know, right, what their community spends on policing, some of those numbers are already available online in public budgets, but you have the right to request access to that information. And if you send an email or make a call, a request in writing to the agency who's in charge of that, whether it's the city manager or, you know, the mayor or whoever, and ask, hey, under the Records Request Act, I want the number of what the police budget is this year. They have to give it to you. And if they don't, you could sue them.
That part, because so the Public Records Act request was essentially suspended indefinitely by the League of City Mayors during quarantine because they asserted that due to quarantine, they are not able to meet the demands of the requests based on the.
Did that go? I thought they were requesting the mayor or the governor ban it, but I don't know if that actually.
I hope someone litigates that all the way up to the Supreme Court, because that ain't gonna fucking stand.
Granted, and I don't know that there's an active challenge against it, so that's to be continued. But the very fact that they were trying to not provide us with Public Records Act requests when they're given federal stimulus in the billions as an emergency fund, and we're not able to see how that's allocated is hugely concerning, especially in the light of the fact that they just purchased a brand new military tank.
Well, especially because they weren't doing all their other regular functions because of coronavirus. So it's like, if they're not doing other shit, then why can't they spend the time to find the records? You know what I mean? Like, that's like low labor intensive work that could be done from home. So
personnel working from home, you don't need to be actually in the office to provide records.
I just found myself doing the same thing.
So, you know, if you haven't noticed, we're pointing out all the little the inefficiencies and the flaws in our systems that we need to attack and crack. Because we are pointing out the problems. It's just a matter of people showing up and showing out against them. Because when you do show out, your voice is being loud, then they are, you know, more inclined to be held accountable than say we stay silent and they just make all these votes and decisions and they get away with it.
So kind of going back to that, there's three prongs of holding police accountable. You have criminal, you have civil, and you have administrative. At every level, they're shielded. And we have to attack every single level differently with a different plan. Administratively, that's when you write a citizen's complaint to internal affairs, they investigate themselves. Doesn't do anything. Criminally, DA's in bed with the cops. They're not going to charge their cops almost ever. If they do, when they have a trial, good luck finding 12 jurors without one bootlicker that says, you know, cops, I'll support the police no matter what. That's a really hard jury to find, and civilly too. And then on the civil side, on the other prong, you have qualified immunity, and the same issue with juries. So it's just at every single level is they're shielded and protected so well. There's no accountability. There's no accountability there.
Definitely.
Well, that's why we have, so I want to focus on what can we do about these shields? What can the people do about these shields right now?
Well, it sounds like since there's a budget hearing thing that's showing up, protesting and marching on something like that would be a starter.
Right? This is where your marches would matter. This is where your protests will matter.
Flooding the county supervisors' emails and faxes with letters saying, hey, we don't want more funding to the police. Please consider defunding because it has these advantages. You know, if you know a few thousand people sent that in, that sends a huge message.
I was going to suggest putting pressure on your county district attorney's office, both not to prosecute any protest-related crimes, right? If they get a flood of emails, that's something that your coronavirus, like, quarantined mom can do from home, is send emails to the county district attorney. Their email address is online. Just send it to the main box, you know. Do not prosecute any protest-related arrests is one thing that everybody can do. Another thing that everybody can do, right, is start putting pressure on your county district attorneys to adopt charging policies that are in line with your values, right? Like, maybe we don't prosecute weed. Maybe we don't prosecute stuff that's found in a search when the person was just pulled over because of license plate or registration, right? That's the kind of things they're doing in San Francisco. Maybe we stop gang enhancements, right? But there are things that can be done, and your district attorney has so much power. And if they're not willing to make those changes, then maybe you vote them out, because that is an elected position in every community.
Yeah. So what do you think on Anne-Marie Schubert because like it showed last election that she won the election by a lot. So for when you have a city like Sacramento, is it a matter? I'm not exactly sure what the voting numbers as far as age demographics were, but is there even enough people in cities that don't have more minorities or minorities vote? Like how do we actually vote her out? Because like it seems like even when people were trying to, she still won by a landslide.
I think we got to take advantage of the rage. Look, in everything I do, and through all my schooling and my job working in the law, I am fueled by absolute rage.
Yeah.
All right. That's why I work in civil rights, because I'm infuriated.
Yeah.
And that's why people are on the streets right now, willing to get shot with pepper balls and rubber bullets and take those baton beatings because it's rage. That's what brings you to the street, and that's what brings people to the polls. I think we can't let go of it. I think we need to redirect that.
So I guess
rage.
what I'm asking is, do you think there's enough of a demographic that did not vote or change their vote from last time to get people to vote?
Especially, sorry to say,
Well, if I could weigh in on that a little bit.
and
That was one of the biggest things.
we don't vote. We don't.
There's like 2 million I saw next week that didn't vote.
Yo, if we showed up, maybe it is. It's true. Minorities don't vote. Hardly anybody in my family votes.
What were you gonna say, Claire?
What I was gonna say is that my late husband was had a deeply held belief that if we educated people about the power that the district attorney has, then they would be more likely to either, to take more care about their vote for who they vote for district attorney. Most people don't know anything about the judges they vote for, or the DA they vote for, or the school board. Like the local officials, they don't know a lot about them. At most, a lot of times they might know the city council person, right? But when we start to really publicize who the DA is, what their values are, what their decisions are, what kind of power they have, and then demonstrate like the different choices, then that can make a big difference. In Sacramento, y'all had a really great, Todd Liris, who's a pretty liberal or progressive, so to speak, district attorney candidate. That was his name, right? Todd Liris? No, it's been a minute for me. But the point is that, hosting town halls with district attorney candidates, making known what the DA can and can't do, I think has significant power in terms of either turning current voters or bringing people to the polls specifically for that office, right, who maybe otherwise aren't voting. If they know that that's the person who's going to decide who goes to prison and who doesn't, or who gets charged with a crime and who doesn't, that's really, really powerful stuff.
Yeah.
Dude, so regarding the DA election for Anne Marie Schubert in Sacramento County, that was just about the most discouraging and most disappointing election that I've ever campaigned on. We had Sean King drop $100,000 into this campaign specifically to beat out Schubert. We had walkers, we've had campaign offices. I had never seen a campaign that was against her from the streets as much as I've seen people come out against Schubert. And she still won. And a lot of my political connections, the people that I call friends, endorsed her in the name of establishment. And so when I'm looking at something like that, where we're going against political partnerships, I'm still looking for the answers on how we can overcome that.
I'm sorry, who support? Who were you talking about that you said support? Like,
I'm talking about school board members. I'm talking about fellow assembly members. I'm talking about supervisors.
well, so then that just tells me that there has to be that then you have to then not re-elect those people who support it.
Right. So I want to make that very clear. If you are against somebody like the DA in a county like Sacramento County, and this person is consistently being endorsed by your fellow elected officials, then they are not your elected officials. They are not your representative. And I'm not going to sit here and call them all out by name. I will actually list them after this is over, so you can know for a fact who not to vote for again.
Well, and one thing that's important about DA campaigns, right, that is not usually present in the discussion is what the fuck their platform is.
Exactly.
It's usually like a name versus a name. Like, what are your policies as a district attorney? What kind of laws are you going to change? Like, what kind of, not laws, but like, how are you going to enforce those laws, right? Like, are you going to charge minors with misdemeanors? Are you going to enforce drug crimes? Are you going to charge, undocumented people? It's like, there are so many decisions that they can make, and we see, I know that we lost in Sacramento. We lost in Oakland too. We lost Nancy O'Malley. That was a fucking heartbreaker. We had an incredible Black woman candidate who challenged her, who had a Harvard pedigree and so much behind her. And we lost, and it was devastating. But, the idea is that because we forced a platform discussion, that forced Nancy O'Malley into policies that she otherwise never would have adopted without the competition, right? Like, she had to come out with this whole reformative justice fucking alternative to incarceration program just to win the election, which she never would have come up with on her own. And so exposing their platform and making them commit to things makes them say out loud what they stand for. And I think that there's value in that. Even when we take those heartbreaking losses, you know, the work you guys did there was so powerful. And, you know, we got to keep rallying, because it is hard to unseat district attorneys, especially when most people don't even know the power of that job. Most people think that the cop decides who gets charged. Most people think that, and that's just not true. And if they found out that the district attorney had the power of who gets charged, I think that they would really take a lot more of an interest in who the fuck that person is.
Yeah, I want everyone to understand. Most people don't really even understand that DAs are elected by the people. Sheriffs are elected by the people. As much as we have opinions about our current sheriff right now, people voted for him. People voted him back into office, okay? And so who do we have to hold accountable sometimes but ourselves? You know, we can't complain if we voted for these people, right? I voted for Anne Marie Schubert the first time around, not knowing how she was going to be. I own that, right? But of course, I did not want her to be reelected, and here we are. So going back to the idea of defunding the police, I think that I've been attacked a lot this past week for various reasons, but I won't get into all of those. Mainly the defunding the police. I think that people were really trying to challenge me on the fact that the term defund is to abolish. Then there are other people who came for me saying that we do need to abolish the police altogether, and we do need to imagine a world in which all police are abolished. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a long-term goal, of course. Abolition, abolition of the, I'm sorry, I got shot in the head. I'm having trouble.
Shot in the head.
I'm having trouble speaking. Abolishing the police should be the final goal, but that's not happening tomorrow. And I don't think anybody thinks that's happening tomorrow. And I don't think anybody wants that to happen tomorrow, because we are not there. Our system isn't functioning.
Yeah,
I guess
well,
I guess I gotta go, because I thought it's a lot.
Yeah.
And the idea of defunding the police sounds good until somebody breaks into your grandma's house and you can't get there, or aren't adequately prepared to deal with whatever that situation is. So while I think I'm just more in line with to pulling back on their responsibilities on what they actually should do, or having them be more of an assistant to social workers or whatever, more so than, because when you think about a world without police, then if I have a storefront business, who is to stop the people from actually breaking in? I have to pay private security for that, but then even then, that's then coming out of my budget to protect my business and my interests and stuff like that, because people, I think what gets lost in a lot of this is a lot of the people who are saying this aren't actually business owners. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But you can't sit there. It's like when businesses with COVID-19, if they shut down, they're not making any money, then you can't necessarily expect them to pay their employees the full amount if their employees aren't doing anything. Because when they can't, or you can't, employees can't sit there and say, well, we want all these crazy raises, because that's what they have to keep money for in the bank for a rainy day. So it's one of those things where
that's a capitalism thing, though.
Yeah, like I kind of respectfully disagree with you gentlemen about some of that analysis. And this is why I am in favor of abolishing the police immediately today. I would completely defund them. I would take every dollar from them. I would fire every one of those motherfuckers. They would be on the street, every single one. Why, right? I hear you about business owners. I'm a business owner. You know what I mean? I've also lived in places that are considered high violent crime areas. You know what I'm saying? Like, I had my kids in Vallejo. You know what I mean? Like, I have lived in places where there is high violent crime, and the police are not the answer to that, is what I've discovered. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you're in a life or death situation where there's a gun on you, or your grandma's facing her life, you know, it is very rare that in that situation, the police are also going to be responsive and helpful. You know what I'm saying? Like, does there need to be intervention? Fuck yeah. Like, I don't expect your grandma to be on her own. You know what I mean? Like, I don't expect myself to be able to get there necessarily, but I do trust that there are other community forces, you know, at play that can aid community safety in a way that's different than what we assume that the cops would do if they did it right. You know, I do think we need a replacement. I'm with you on that.
That's what I want to flesh out more of. What is that?
My bad. I don't mean
for that versus, because I'm with you, I would love to see it abolished. I guess because in my mind, I can't get past the part of what is the replacement is where, which is then just kind of leads me back to more of his idea, because I can't think of what, but now, for instance, if you had like the things like the Black Panther Party, or, you know, just private security, like even if, like I said, it was just something where you hired like ex-military people who came back to just secure the streets or whatever. I don't know, but I just do feel like there has to be some form of not necessarily feeling the responsibilities of the police,
Right.
but somebody to protect the people who can't protect themselves.
Really quickly, I just want to reintroduce, for those that are just joining in, we've got Russell Stiger Jr., he's a photojournalist. We have Danny Garza here, he's an NLG board member and legal observer trainer, know your rights trainer, who was just shot in the face by the police last week. We have Claire White from Dope Lies, she's a criminal defense attorney. And we just have now joining us Assemblymember Ash Kalra. Welcome to our Organized Voices podcast, our first episode on police reform. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on your first episode. I'm honored.
Let me
Yeah.
just say one thing. But
Okay.
Claire, just
Okay.
so we're clear though, if you have that idea of whoever else should, I'm with you all the way on the abolishment of it. I'm just a little bit, I'm just curious as to what would be the alternative of, because sometimes when there isn't a plan for what the vacuum of that's going to be, you end up in chaos. So that's just because I can't figure that out. But if you had the answer and it sounded good, and with the way you explain it, I'd be right there championing whatever you was talking.
I hear you.
We're
That's
talking-
always the fear. I don't pretend to have the answers, but I don't think we could get to the answers until we're past this shit. Because while this is like what's in our mind as the answer,
you're cutting out.
conceive of, you know what I mean? Like, I agree, create solution.
Yeah.
And right now we think that putting these fucking armed cops on the streets is the answer. And I think we'll get somewhere else, but smarter minds than me are gonna have to get us there.
I agree.
So Ash, sorry to have you join in at a very heated
No, I love it. I can just sit here and listen. This is great.
Yeah, no, but you know, I just want to point out, Ash was my public defender in 2006 when I caught my first and only felony case, and he's been the reason, you know, and a motivator to bring me to where I am today. So I just want to give you the warmest thank you for everything you've done for me to inspire me, and you still remain a hero of mine to this day for standing for the people and for caring about racial inequality. You know, you've been public defender to city council to first Indian American elected to state office. I'm so proud to have you join us. Thank you, you know, for everything you do. But talk to us about what's going on right now, just to warm up, and then we want to get into your bills.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for those kind words. And you're the one that did it. I didn't do your great journey is your journey. I'm lucky that I played a part in it. But you've earned every single bit of where you are and where you're going to go. And so, you know, and speaking of the National Lawyers Guild, I was just on a conversation earlier today with about 45, 50 or so of my local constituents that are part of different groups.
Yeah.
South Bay Progressive Alliance, indivisible groups, the Socialist Democrats of America, Democratic Party, kind of a lot of folks that are very concerned with what's happening, particularly in the streets here in San Jose. And I mention that because one of my dear friends, Ruth Silver Tobe, is someone I work very closely on labor issues.
Yeah.
And she's also a legal observer and saw all the stuff that was happening here in San Jose,
Yeah.
similar to stuff that's been happening in a lot of the urban areas in terms of militarization and kind of that warlike response to what's going on and the concerns that it brings up. But I mention that because this is really, I think, and I mentioned this when I talk about COVID, that COVID is exposing, it's not creating inequities, it's exposing inequities that already exist and have existed for a long time, especially in places like Silicon Valley with the extreme income inequality. And similarly, the current, you know, kind of Black liberation uprising that's happening because of the torture and murder of George Floyd, as all of you know, has not created these issues. It's exposing them, and in a good way, it's exposing them to a whole lot of people that either didn't know about it or didn't take it seriously. They may have heard like, yeah, I know this issue happens, but I didn't think it was that bad, right? And so I think there's a great opportunity. Certainly we're seeing here in San Jose in terms of not just immediate accountability of what's happening, you know, in terms of how the police are responding to protests or the quick fixes that are being offered, but you're seeing like even with some of these kind of suburban folks that are pretty well off here in San Jose, they're not having it. It's actually quite amazing to see that they want more, that they're not accepting just the knee-jerk response from City Hall or from the police department. I've never seen that before. It's a very exciting time, as you mentioned, you know, having worked as a public defender for 11 years and now in my, what is this, my 12th year in elected office, I never thought we'd get to this. In fact, even before this, the last couple of years, getting rid of the felony murder, getting rid of 3-year, you know, drug sales prior, getting the 1-year prison prior, making the 5-year discretionary, and on and on and on. When I was a public, I never would have imagined that any of that would have been happening, let alone what we're seeing now in the streets, the movement that can push us even further, where you have Gavin, in a good way, proposing closing a prison down, and then almost instantaneously when we get hit with the budget, and then we, because of COVID, and then you have Black Lives Matter in the streets, and now it's gonna be 2 prisons, right? It's just like the momentum is here in a way that we just haven't seen before. At least I haven't seen in the 24 years I've been working in the industry.
Can I ask you, like, can you tell me more about how your colleagues have changed their perspective since, let's say, pre-corona and George Floyd to now? Because it seems like even like from the celebrity NFL perspective, like more people, as you said, that were not really saying anything are kind of saying things. So do you see that push also in with your colleagues, or are they still kind of on the fence? If you could speak on that.
I think it's a mix. I think that every one of my colleagues is definitely recognizing, it's hard not to, what's happening in the streets and what have you, but that doesn't always translate to what happens in the building. And I know Elizabeth knows this, like it doesn't always work out that way, that people will show up for marches or for photo ops. And I think that there's more, right now it's far more genuine than that. I think people really are concerned. They're really, you know, empathizing with what's happening in the community. I think it's along a spectrum though, as to those colleagues that are willing to do something about it. Now, there's a number of my colleagues that have been very great on criminal justice reform and what have you. And in fact, we just got a vote to bring back to the ballot overturning Prop 209 to bring back affirmative action. Got 60 votes on the Assembly floor out of 78 people that were there. Do I think it would have gotten 60 votes 2 or 3 months ago? Probably not.
Yeah.
So I think that there's no doubt that there is an impact that's happening. We had a vote on examining reparations, which was an overwhelming vote, a bipartisan vote. Would it have passed before? Probably. I think certainly would it have gotten as many votes. But the key is long-term, meaningful fixes. Are my colleagues, our city council members, folks in Congress, whatever, are they down for the long haul? And that's what is yet to be seen.
Does your guys' like the way that you guys have to run the campaigns every so often, does that also affect the amount of changes you can have? Because if the Assembly is running every 2 years, correct, and the Senate is every 4 years, how are you actually, if you have to campaign every so often, how are you actually able to focus on implementing change is what I don't understand.
Well, we have the time and energy to focus on both, but you're right. The 2-year cycles presents a lot of issues because you have to answer to everybody every 2 years. Now, the good news about now is that there's a lot more people to answer to than 4 or 5 months ago. And so the impact and the effect of lobbyists is going to be somewhat reduced, in my opinion. Also, COVID has an impact on that as well. We don't have lobbyists running around the building, which is, I mean, the physical presence, right? I mean, the physical presence of lobbyists not being there makes a huge, we've been home. I mean, now we've been going back to Sacramento for our session. Other than that, we're taking Zoom meetings, we're at home. The access from the lobbyists has been cut off a lot. And so that's just a practical, real thing that's happening. And so I think that there's an opportunity because every assembly member is on the ballot this November. Every single one, and probably half the senators are on the ballot.
Yeah.
Every House representative member is on the ballot this year. And so because of the timing of this movement, there's an opportunity to hold folks accountable and say, hey, this is what we demand. Are you willing to do it?
So I have one last question for you, because I covered AB 392, right? And I noticed that Shirley Weber definitely had a lot of support from the community when it came to just testimonials and the amount of people that would come out, and even garnering a bunch of different committee support. So when people are out and marching, if there is something that is a hearing that day, do you guys see or feel the impact of when people come out like that, or is it just still kind of do you guys hear the voices of the many, or is it most times just kind of gone, being heard?
There's a combination. I hear it, but honestly, it's got to be sustained. Like if people just show up one day for a march or a rally and then they're gone the next day, well, the lobbyists are still there. They're there all year. A lot of that's relationship, but they're paid to build relationships, right? And that's lobbyists on everything, whether they're pro-environment, pro-oil. I'm not, that's just across the board. Now, so in fact, I just said this. I spoke at City Hall in San Jose at the Black Lives Matter rally yesterday, and this is exactly the message I was saying to them. A lot of young people, and where do they turn that energy towards? Well, they need to turn it towards City Hall, towards the Capitol, and a lot of them get that. They just don't know how to, and so it's on me. It's on folks like you to teach them how to do that and create a sustained relationship. And so that means showing up in their assembly member or their city council member's district, showing up at the town halls, not just when an incident occurs, but for years to come. And I think the great thing to see is that now we're 2-3 weeks, people are in the streets every day, not just here, around the world. In San Jose, they're at City Hall every day and have been. They're not going anywhere. Yeah. But the question is, what do you do with that street? I don't want that street energy to go away, but how do you translate that into impacting and affecting the legislators?
Okay, I just want to quickly say one thing about that to the audience. This is really a time, Ash, you just blew my mind with that nugget there, because this is truly a time where lobbyists aren't able to lobby for their special interests because of COVID right now, which gives us an advantage to at least be heard more louder than we've been able to be heard going up against powerful, rich lobbyists that are flooding the Capitol buildings. So thank you very much for that.
I mean, I want to make clear, they still have cell numbers, they're still communicating, but it's not to the same degree. And I think because of thousands of people, look at LA today, tens of thousands of people in the street.
Right.
People are paying attention. My colleagues are paying attention, city council members, you cannot ignore that. And if they don't show up, not just in the street, but they don't show up when it comes to voting for Black Lives Matter, people are paying attention more now than they were before.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Ash, I do have a quick question. Since your rise kind of in your political endeavors, what has been kind of a method for you in working with or collaborating with groups that may not have the same interests as you? So for example, police associations. I know politics is very heavily immersed in how you deal with those entities.
Yeah.
What would be advice that you can give to somebody who wants to tackle an issue like Black Lives Matter, but not maybe vilify or, be so abrasive when it comes to making deals with people like that?
Well, I mean, that's a great point. And I've always been able to, in fact, this goes back to my days as a public defender. There were some DAs, some defense attorneys that were so toxic. Everything was war, and it hurt their other cases because no one wanted to interact with them or they didn't like working with them. I recognize that to do well for my clients, I needed to be respectful of all parties. It doesn't mean you don't advocate tough. Same on the city council, same in the legislature. And so my door's open to everyone, even if whether I agree with them or not, in order to try to find compromise. It's not about, hey, cops are good, cops are bad. I know some folks that are friends of mine that are decent people. It's not about that. It's about the institution. And so when you get past the defensiveness saying, hey, look, I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm saying we need to fix this institution that you're part of. And that's not easy to hear for folks because they want to believe that they can fix it themselves, or they want to believe like, no, our institution is just fine. We just need a couple of tweaks. And so the same thing, I battled the Chamber of Commerce on a lot of things. I'm fighting for workers' rights, environmental justice, and all that. I'll sit down with them. I try to compromise, but I will never compromise to the point that the principles of my bill or the principles I stand for are being compromised. There's got to be a limit. And the problem with elected officials is that oftentimes, I've seen it in City Hall and see it, is that they start to compromise their principles a little bit, and they think, oh, well, just a little bit here, a little bit there. I'm still better than whoever else is going to be in my spot. And next thing you know, everything's transactional. Everything is just about how they preserve their position of power and how they advance. So as long as you don't, compromise is a good word, collaboration is a good word, but not compromising your principles. And that's where you've got to be able to talk to people even when you disagree with them, Republican, Trump supporter, whatever. At least make that effort.
Yeah.
And they're not willing to meet you, they're not willing to meet you, but don't put it on yourself. That's stopping that communication.
Okay, that's awesome. That's good advice. And so speaking on that, on your principles, tell us about your reform bill on racial inequality.
Yeah. So, and this is actually interesting because I introduced a bill earlier this year, and it had the coalition of social justice, criminal justice reform organizations, Ella Baker Center, ACLU, Smart Justice, and on and on and on. It's called the Racial Justice Act. And so to give a little background on it for my legalese, in 1987, a Georgia case went to the Supreme Court, McCleskey v. Georgia. And basically what the court determined in this death penalty case, the defense attorney was able to show, hey, there's an extreme amount of racism in this particular county, in the way cases are prosecuted, or in how death, and specifically to that one, it was death penalty. Hey, we've shown that the death penalty is disproportionately applied based upon the skin color of the defendant, based upon the skin color of the victim. The court agreed. The court said, yes, we agree with you that racism plays a role in these convictions, but because you couldn't show in this specific case that race played a role, too bad. So ever since then, the law of the land is that, yes, the United States acknowledges that race plays a role in our criminal justice system, but we're not going to do anything about it. So my bill, the California Racial Justice Act, and in that court case, they said states can do their own thing. So they could actually do something about it. So it's only been, how many years is it? 33 years later. But I'm trying to get the California Racial Justice Act passed. What that would allow is in the arrest, in the court proceedings, in terms of the court case, the sentencing, if you can show that race played a role, even if it's, hey, this department arrests black defendants or black suspects 4 times more than white suspects on these particular cases, that kind of overall macro data can be used to show that race played a role and thereby deem a mistrial or overturn a case. It's a groundbreaking.
Monumental. I mean, so Cory Booker was just on Stephen Colbert earlier this week to state that there are scientific data to support that race plays an indicator, the biggest indicator in your likelihood of death, disease, any kind of life expectancy rate that's affected is race. So what kind of challenges do you see coming for you in proposing a bill that's so as monumental as this?
So I introduced it earlier this year, and 2 issues came up, and this is all before the murder of George Floyd. I think it may have been a different scenario if it was after that, but COVID. And so I introduced 27 bills this year. I had to cut it down to 9, and a lot of them weren't my choice. This one wasn't my choice. I didn't want to lose this bill, but the committee didn't hear it, and they had an excuse because of COVID, but also because the DAs around the state lobbied hard.
I bet. That's what I was thinking.
In fact, I spoke to a DA, and the DA said, hey, Ash, how are we going to try cases? And his point was that how are they going to be able to try a case if they have to be able to show that race didn't play a role? My position is, why are you putting the burden on those that are being accused and prosecuted?
Right.
The burden should be on the government.
You guys hear that?
Yeah.
Oh my God. What was there? I mean,
there's no answer to it. I understand their position because the reality is, it's going to be a lot harder for them to prosecute, but it should be harder for them to prosecute.
It should be.
If we can show that race plays that kind of role. And so now I'm trying to find a way to resuscitate the bill. There's a lot of procedures that create obstacles in that, but if I'm able to bring it back, hopefully I can bring it back in the next month or so. If I'm not, I'm going to bring it back in January and basically go on a roadshow around the state and get activists aware. especially with people in the street. This is the time they should be aware we had the opportunity to do something that's monumental, that would be a landmark around the nation and a model to follow. If we really mean what people, instead of just showing up at a march, you actually mean what you say when you say Black Lives Matter.
Oh
And
my
if you
gosh.
do, then this is a bill that actually can do something about it in a fundamental way.
Yeah, no, I'm about to register as a lobbyist today. Help you lobby for this. I hope the audience heard this is a bill that prohibits a DA from prosecuting if it's based on race. If we can prove that it's based on race, that they would not be able to prosecute. So imagine what that would do for our criminal justice reform efforts, in being able to lessen the amount of prosecutions that come out based on a person's race. So,
and this was brought to me by the Anti-Death Penalty Coalition, because although Gavin Newsom has put a moratorium, death penalty is still not illegal. So they want to be able to at least get some of the guys on death row, get them new trials based upon that. So there's an opportunity here. It's not going to be easy, but and oh, by the way, the bill number is AB 2200.
AB 2200.
AB 2200. So 2200, and if you look it up, my last name is Kalra, Kalra. So you just Google Kalra AB 2200. You should learn more about it.
So let me ask you a quick question about, as far as the bill being brought up and all that stuff. If enough people just demanded it at protests and stuff, would that also get the attention of, because just people are demanding it to get it back in front of legislation? Is that something where, even though you had to cut it down, where if enough people just rally behind it, they could get it back in front of the attention now, instead of waiting till the next time the posse bring it up and start the whole process over again?
Absolutely. In fact, that kind of specificity is critical in terms of public outcry. If you're rallying, if you're showing up and you have specific asks, for example, let's arrest the officers that murdered George Floyd, very specific ask, because that ask was so clear, the outcome occurred relatively quickly, whereas if there wasn't a video or anything, it never would have happened, right? And so a specific ask on a bill, a specific ask on, hey, stop using rubber bullets, those kinds of specific asks when folks are coming together are critical, and then lobbying members in the building and in their district. And so we have a coalition of criminal justice organizations that when we go forward, if we're able to go forward with this bill, they're going to show up and they're going to schedule meetings with every single member, every senator. They're going to show up. And so having people in the movement that understand that that's happening to add to those voices is critical.
Absolutely. So so we have about 15 minutes left on our podcast, and I wanted to ask you, before we let you go, what are your thoughts and pieces of advice on police reform right now, as far as the talk of defunding, the police, and maybe alternative programs to take place of law enforcement as it looks now?
There's a huge opportunity to do it. And the reality is that some people have a problem with saying defunding the police. I don't care what they call it. The reality is, the idea is that the police shouldn't be the response to every societal issue. When there's homeless, when there are homeless folks, when you have a neighbor dispute, when you have at schools, I taught at a high school in Anacostia, Southeast DC, kids are going through metal detectors. It's ridiculous, right? And so, in fact, it's already happening, whether they call it defund or not. In San Francisco, Mayor Breda's already said they're not going to send police officers just to non-criminal events, homelessness, neighborhood stuff, and all that. So it's already happening, and they can call it that. They can call it something else. But yeah, I mean, this is the time to absolutely do it. It's about a budget, and a budget is a moral document. Where are we going to put that money? We spent 40 years becoming the incarceration capital of the world. Yeah. Now it's time to take that money back.
Right.
Well, speaking of the budget, I guess, is it almost up to the state, because it doesn't seem like cities get it that they need to invest in the kids? So does there need to be a statewide legislation that requires cities to invest more into education, kids, and social work versus the police? Can there be a statewide legislation that says this much of your budget cannot exceed police, or something like that? Because it almost seems like no city really wants to be responsible for that. They really just They like when it's always okay for police to get more money, but as soon as it's diverting money from the police, it becomes a problem. Even though if you divert money from the police, they shouldn't. Like I guess the example I can think about is the kid who was in PSAC, and the problem with that law is the law was passed to then also make it where 18 to 21-year-olds can't buy tobacco, and then some of that money then went to policing that aspect, and then a kid buys tobacco, receives tobacco illegally, and the adult isn't actually prosecuted, and the kid is a black kid. And so it seems like there's laws that are in place that add money to police forces and add money to policing, but there aren't many laws that cities invest in the youth social work and education system.
That's a great question. And we're already seeing some of this happening. Some of the school boards are canceling their contracts with police, right? That's an example of an action taken by a local body. Now, the state can't specifically say because of local governance rules and local control, we can't say spend X on this, X on that, X on that. But what we can do and have been doing, as we've been trying to decarcerate over the last couple of years, is putting more money giving more money to probation if that money is going to not putting people in jail, but actually getting them into social programs, job training, substance abuse. So we can add strings attached to some of the money because we've defunded mental health. We've defunded all this, substance abuse programs for years. So we will prioritize funding those types of programs. And then if they want that money, instead of saying, hey, here's money for you to buy military equipment or money for you to do some extra training on, merge units or on, drug enforcement. No, we're going to give you more money to demilitarize. We're going to give you more money, cities and counties, to actually go use social services to actually combat the homelessness problem and mental health. We'll give you money for mental health teams instead of for SWAT teams.
Exactly, and I think that is definitely a great solution, especially if the state does hold to that. I'm not saying they won't, but especially if cities and then implement that, because the theory is a great theory that it's essentially kind of saying the same thing of what I was just saying, but in a more practical sense you could do right now is saying, okay, so if you guys are going in these things or hitting these marks for this type of progression, we can attach this X amount of dollars to that for this, instead of saying, okay, well, you're giving so much money to police and you don't even qualify for these extra dollars that we could give you by just diverting or doing some of these things.
And part of the problem is we can't force them. Like if we say, hey, we have X amount of money for mental health treatment in the court system, so you can have mental health courts or substance abuse courts, we can't force them to take it. And that's part of the problem. The big cities, the big counties tend to apply and want to do those things. Some of the sheriffs, some parts of California are pretty conservative and have pretty conservative sheriffs. So in some cases, we're going to have to force the issue. And we've done that, even with SB 54, not allowing law enforcement to interact with ICE. We did that not because of San Jose or LA. We did that because of all these other counties that said, no way, we're not going to stop our relationship with the federal government. And so we can force the issue in some regard, but in terms of directly how they use their budget, not necessarily. It's more carrot and stick. I think we can put carrots towards things that we want to see more of.
Oh, I think.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and telling us about your bills and all of your efforts and giving us some good advice for the people on the ground fighting this movement. So we hope to continue our discussions with you and strategizing with you and learning from you. So thank you very much for being a source of inspiration for all of our people and to continue being a champion fighting for our civil rights. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and good luck. Congratulations on starting this up. And I have my Debug Protect Your People shirt on.
Protect your people.
Shout out to Silicon Valley Debug. But thank you all for what you're doing. Thanks for educating our people. And let's keep fighting together. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining Organized Voices on our first episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. So I think Stevante was checking in. I don't know what happened to him. Let me see thank you guys for tuning in with my live here. Let me figure out what's going on with Stevante. 1 second. Yeah. 1 second. I have to pause it. Damn it, I have to end it, I guess.
And what?
The live, just because Stevante is trying to text me.
Oh.
Was that it?
Huh?
Was that it?
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
2 hours at this
Yeah.
point. So.
All right. Damn, it doesn't feel like it.
I know well, if Devontae shows up, we're gonna have to do a little interview with him.
I'm gonna let you take care of that.
What? You're not gonna stay?
Uh,
Just stay for just like 10 minutes. I'm only gonna give him 10 minutes because he did me wrong, flaking on me.
I just
Don't have me.
I hear you. I ain't nothing I need to hear from you.
Whatever.
You know.
Hello, what happened to you? Okay, are you still coming or no?
You should save it for another episode. You shouldn't even.
Huh?
Yeah.
Shouldn't even have it.
Why did I just reschedule then?
Yeah, I mean, come a different day. It's no point. Just so, because he can fill up the whole episode.
Yeah,
right?
you could probably fill up a whole episode. He said, I know.
Exactly my point.
Yeah, so do you want to just reschedule? I mean, we got Russ here. I got Danny here from NLG. I got my boy Victor. We just wrapped up. I still have like 5 minutes left.
2 hours later.
Yeah, we've already finished the podcast. Yeah, it's all good. All right, we'll reschedule. Okay, I'll holler at you. All right.
Give him his own episode. Give him
Yeah.
another episode.
But today was good though.
Lights are hot.
I know, right? I'm sweating up a storm. I was just like,
Can I turn these on?